Then I will start, and first I will introduce very briefly to you the Radicalisation Awareness Network. We are commissioned by the European Commission, who officially started the initiative at 9/11/2011. And what we are basically doing is bringing together practitioners who are working on or whose work is impacted by violent extremism, the preventing of it or countering. And we do this by exchange. We're doing this during meetings, for example. And during these meetings, experiences are shared, also methods are shared. It's also about dissemination. We are producing papers, also best practices. And the third important part is we give advice that can be to the European Commission, but it can also be more in general, that we give advice to certain professional groups or governments how to work with the matter of violent extremism and the prevention of this. Then we are also covering all kinds of radicalizations leading to violent extremism. So extreme right, Islamist extremism, far left, and everything what pops up new. And I think one of our main efforts is that we have a very big database, meanwhile, which is open source available, where you can pick everything you want. And this is available on this website. And as my slides will be shared, you don't have to write down now this web link. One of the features we have is that we work with working groups, and these working groups are the places where these professionals, these practitioners come together, and these are the new established working groups. We just started a new period as run, and so we have communication and narratives, families, communities and social care, local for local authorities, mental health, police, which is more on local policing and preventive than on really catching the terrorists, prison, rehabilitation, victims of terrorism, and youth and education. So this very briefly as an introduction to RAN, and then going on to the topic of today. Within RAN, we have been working on rehabilitation actually since the initial phase, because, for example, we had a working group on deradicalization already. And yeah, it was always on the agenda. And I think it became very topical when we had the foreign fighter phenomenon, which led to an increase of people first leaving Europe, but then also the idea that those people would come back. And this led in 2017 to the production of the Return You Manual, which is also available online, which explains about what you can do if people return from as a foreign fighter into Europe in our case. Our effort was not sufficient, was our feeling, because the complexity of the process of rehabilitation is sometimes still overwhelming to a lot of professionals. We also see throughout Europe, but even within member states or within organizations or among practitioners, that we don't have any coherent definitions. And that it's quite challenging who is responsible for what. And so we said we should actually put together the existing knowledge and promising practices to help the practitioners throughout Europe and also beyond. So that implies that we have a new manual, and that is this one. That is the Rehabilitation Manual, which is to be published by the end of this month. It has been written by a team of Violence Prevention Network led by Dennis Valkenhorst. It contains brief descriptions of phases people have to go through in rehabilitation, also a detailed analysis of these phases, and then also who should be involved during these phases. We are also working here with best practices in it, so people can have some further points of inspiration, and we end up with some general recommendations, some further reading session, and also an annex where we have actually broke our information together that every practitioner can see in which part of the phases should I be involved, would I be responsible. If we break it down, the rehabilitation process in the scheme we have been working on, our basic idea was that first you will have to work on deradicalization, which here both consists cognitive distancing, so getting out of the ideology, and also disengagement, so going out of the group. and that you then should work at integration, which is social integration, which might be returning to your family, to your community, or going into an entirely new community. And you have the functional integration, which is more like how to be an independent citizen, having your own home, your own job, and so on. These are the efforts. The other thing we have to work at is a kind of stabilization, because people, of course, first went to a shock by radicalizing and then by de-radicalizing. And then at the end of the day, you have to be in a kind of steady stage, which we have been calling the rehabilitated person. And what was also already just mentioned during the questions and during the previous speakers, the question always is, what can we do voluntary and what is compulsory? And I here made a kind of metaphor. It's not really aesthetic that you could say, well, this is academically being proven what's here, but it's more to show you that in the beginning of the process, when we arrest people, when people are on trial, when they are in prison, you have quite a bit of control over them. And increasingly, when people go out post-release under conditions, and even later when the conditions are over, people are very much more self-determined and they can choose what they want to do. And why I'm showing you this here at this point is that you will see that if you can start in during trial, you can say you should follow this program, or in prison you could mandate people to do something. But if you are not working on the intrinsic motivation of people, you know you will lose them later on during the process, because well, after a certain period of time, they have to become owner of their own new future, their own new life. So it can be helpful if people are mandated to, for example, see some specialists, so that they have a kind of title to come in. But it's our firm belief that, especially on the de-radicalization part, the cognitive distancing, it's very problematic to have mandatory offers here. And one of the things writing the rehabilitation manual, but actually it's already known, if we see this whole process, it's a kind of relay. We see that actually the person who has been radicalized goes the whole lap, and further on he's passed on from person to person, or actually more from multi-agency to multi-agency, from structure to structure. And as we all know, with the relay, most of the time, if everything goes fine, you are faster than walking the whole lap yourself. But mostly, if you don't coordinate this very well, it will be a complete disaster. And another important point is so that it's good to realize that if only the extremist runs the whole lab, we really should work on how to transfer information on him, and also how to transfer the trust that some extremist has in the person who helps him to the next stage that he still works on and is still positive about his change. We finally came to 7 phases, which is about being judged. This is from arrest to pre-trial detention. Then we call it a new reality, the reception. After you have your sentence, you go to prison, or you already were in prison, but you also might be transferred to another department. So you have to start to accept that you are there, and then you come to the phase which we called putting time to use, which is the time that you spent in prison, and how can you use this in a way as efficiently as possible to work at your rehabilitation. This is also the place where, for example, rehab programs come into are visible, but also working with social workers, with psychologists, and so on. Actually, this is gradually going on to the next phase, which is tackling the inevitable. If you are in prison, you will leave prison at a certain moment. And like it also was just said, in Europe, the sentences so far has been relatively quite short. So already after a few years, a lot of people get out again. So you have to prepare for this, prepare in a sense to work on disengagement and cognitive distancing, but also what are you going to do once you're outside? Then we have the release part, and so then you come in a new normal, the first months of post-release. We very often see here a kind of honeymoon phase where people are really glad, and sometimes people also have very high expectations there, and then they meet reality. And then we come to the next phase, is getting what we call getting traction. So the more the reintegration process, so that you really get reintegrated. And 7, finally, on track, that you are being stabilized and that also you don't have any further help anymore. Of course, people will still take care of you in a more security sense. Security service will be interested in you and so on, but you have to solve your own problems mainly independently. What we saw throughout these phases are a few cross-cutting issues. Of course, there are differences to regular offenders, and the ideology is very important here, and also where it's very difficult to make people change their minds, or to say this compulsory, you should now change your mind, which is, of course, is impossible. It also has to do sometimes with that groups are still very strong, and therefore once you get out of prison you are being convinced to go back. And what we sometimes see is that people don't have another goal to live for, and so people are looking for an alternative goal to live for, which also might be another extremist group or belief. Then we have the differences in gender, and I think Jesse already said some things to this, so I'll leave it at here. Of course, in age, if you have very young people, it might be very well possible to give them education, to give them a new start. If you see that some of the perpetrators now also from extreme right are already somewhat older and already had their degrees and so on, but something else went wrong in their life, there might be more issues. And a very important is the one of the stigmatization. And stigmatization has a few angles. First, who wants to have an employee in a supermarket who has a past, for example, fighting in Syria, who was in the neo-Nazi movement? It also has to do with the fact, like it was just referred to by Mitchell, as our programs about hugging terrorists, that sometimes normal criminals, to put it this way, who are imprisoned say, well, if you are acting like a terrorist, you get a better treatment. And this is also having a lot of consequences, because how to motivate a person to rehabilitate and to become a perfect part of society again, if society is reluctant to this? How are you going to motivate them to make this change? Well, finally, we have the risk assessments, which are quite well organized in prison. But if we look further, then we see that risk and needs assessments mostly, especially for communities and for social workers, are much more difficult to accomplish, also because they have a lack of information about everything they would need to know to make this proper assessment. And well, it's also, there are a lot of personal crises throughout these phases. So perhaps you think sometimes you already solved an issue and this might come back again due to life events and so on. These are only a few of the people who are involved in a rehabilitation process, and they are not involved all the time and everywhere. And this is why we, for each phase, we made a picture like this, and this is a kind of circle, and the closer you get to the center of the circle, the more you will be involved as a group. Like, for example, this is preparation for release. We see that society, which is at the right hand up, is still further away than a prison, which is at the left side up. And we're all describing the roles then further within the manual we are producing at this moment. Then finally, I have 2 slides of recommendations left. I think some of them were already mentioned also by the American counterparts, so then it's true if to say this. It's about planning and initiate rehabilitation measures as early as possible, as we know that people get out, and involve as many relevant actors as possible in the development of the goals and the possibilities. What we now sometimes see is that people don't feel any ownership for being part of the process. Very important is that actually in each part of the process, we see a kind of multi-stakeholder cooperation. And then you also have to interlink these different multi-stakeholder and multidisciplinary relations over time. It is very well not only to involve people, but also define and communicate what roles and what responsibilities people do have. Like having clergymen inside does not mean that they should become like a kind of intelligence worker. And the same applies if you involve a teacher, he's not a psychologist and so on. do a task division which is being actually given in by their unique qualities. Continuous monitoring is one of the basic challenges which we found, and which is still also one of the most difficult ones, because we also see that a lot of information gets lost due to data protection, and also sometimes just by not giving something further to a colleague. Then we think it's really important also to involve civic society organizations, because they can play sometimes an independent actor role, as some people do not trust government. So they have an advantage there, that if you are from a CSO, and sometimes also can communicate more easy to the family or the community. That's the next point: engage those communities and families and municipalities. Consider relocation if necessary. For example, we see this quite a bit in an extreme right, when people get out of a certain scene. If they go back, they will have difficulties that they will be pulled in again, so then it's better to bring them to other places. Prevent and counter stigmatization and discrimination on all levels. I think this is one of the challenges that especially also are there for local governments and other people who are close to to the other citizens. And finally, consider age, gender, and other differences throughout the step when designing the programs. Because if one thing is clear, these pathways are lasting long, they are complicated, but they're also very personal. And that terminates my last slide. Thank you very much.